So there's, well, first of all, of course, we don't really have any good evidence for the existence of Jesus. There's no contemporary attestation or nothing that's clear that puts him on earth. But you can explain all that. You can say that, well, okay, yes, the gospel Jesus didn't exist, that he's hugely exaggerated. His fame is hugely exaggerated. And that's the mainstream consensus, is that, yeah, the gospels hugely exaggerate the reality and add all kinds of myth and stuff and stack it on top of this real guy who is really just way more mundane and just not on anyone's radar. He was basically a nobody relative to these other pretenders to the Messiah status that we do have some records of. So we have better records of other messianic pretenders than we do for Jesus. We don't really have anything for Jesus. So that's the first piece of evidence, but that doesn't really decide the question. It just says that, okay, if he existed, he had to be a nobody. But where it starts to get really weird is you look at the earliest documents we have, which are the letters of Paul, 7 of which are authentic, or at least the mainstream consensus is that they're authentic, and the others are forgeries. That's also a consensus view. And in these authentic letters, Paul never clearly seems to refer to Jesus as ever being on earth. He never says like they're killed by that he was executed by the Romans or the Jews. It's all very vague. And he only seems to talk about like the celestial Jesus. And he says like the teachings of Jesus are known through revelation and through reading of ancient scriptures. There's no reference to him having a ministry and so on. All the things that are missing from the letters of Paul, and there's about 20,000 words he wrote. It's really bizarre that there wouldn't be any clearer reference and more obvious argumentation about the historical Jesus as a person and what his life was like and what the witnesses say and so on. That's just not in there. You just know him through revelation. That seems to be the only kind of Jesus that Paul talks about. And we have other examples like Hebrews and 1 Clement seem to talk about Jesus in the same way. Even 1 Peter, 1 Peter seems to talk about Jesus in the same way. And we have other little tiny clues and stuff, but it's that plus how hugely mythologized he was so rapidly is very unusual. When we look at other people that were mythologized that rapidly, they usually don't exist. And that doesn't mean they didn't exist. It just means probability leans in that direction. So more people who are that mythologized didn't exist. You can find exceptions, right? You can say there's some people that existed that were mythologized that heavily, but they're actually the exceptions to the rule. So they're actually uncommon in that respect. So when you put all of those things together, it starts to look like, yeah, it looks like these stories were invented later by people who don't even claim to be eyewitnesses or even cite any eyewitnesses as their sources. They just tell stories as if they're true and as if they know they're true, like magically somehow. And those stories have obvious allegorical content. They have obvious dogmatic purposes. They're not just collections of memories. They're clearly like composed for a purpose. And so when you look at that and you look in the context of like how all other gods and savior gods were treated, they were non-historical people put into history doing the exact same thing. We should suspect that maybe Jesus is just like them. And what we would need is better evidence to prove that he's the exception to the rule. And we just don't have that evidence.